In order to create a layout that has columns side by side, different elements moving around the page where everything's not just spilling down the page like we have here, not only do you need to understand the box model that is explained in your reading and also explained in a previous video that I have up here for you in this lecture, you also have to know how to position things. And there's two ways that it's done. We'll discuss the other way later in the semester, but right now we simply care about a thing called floating. So in your reading this week, you'll hear something about or read something about the normal flow. And the normal flow means that things go down the page, just one after another. When you float something, you can get it to sit next to something else. So if we float something, we should be able to get it to move next to this box right here. And then if we float this, ideally we can get it to sit also side by side. So that's what we talk about when we talk about floating. We are taking things, and I'm very much simplifying this description. You need to read about it in the Styling with CSS book. But when we talk about floating, we are taking things out of the normal flow. And instead we are telling them, okay, float right or float left, and getting things to sit next to each other. And again, this is one of two techniques that are used to move things around the page. And this is the one that's going to build the bulk of your layouts. This isn't just a beginner technique that we only use for a few weeks in the semester. This is how pages are laid out in the web predominantly now, and it has been this way for years. Now, something about floating is that once you start floating, you are causing the browser to not understand things in the same way. So we have this body area here. We'll give it a color just so we can see it. Maybe we have this body with this orange background. And when you float things, suddenly the body, it doesn't necessarily, or the container wrapper, doesn't necessarily see the floated elements anymore. So it may not, if it doesn't know, because you've taken them out of this thing, this normal flow, if it doesn't know that there's something there, how can it wrap it? So the result is that, quite frequently, that the thing that should be seeing them is now no longer seeing them. You might end up with something looking like that. So that's when we bring in another technique that has to do with floating called clearing your float. In this instance, one way to do it, there's a few techniques. One of them, a different technique, is discussed in your reading, and as long as you get there, you're fine. But you have to stop the floating from happening. So the minute you say, hey, first box, you're going to float, you have to actually tell the browser where this floating stops. And to stop the floating, you have to do a thing, there's, like I said, there's many techniques. You have to clear the floating. Think of clear as stopping the floating. So right now we'll say that there is nothing in this document that stops the floating. Not a thing. We'll leave that up there for the moment. And this is what you would get. Your orange box would no longer, and we'll put another thing in here. You get your background browser color, and your salmon box would not show at all. Now, if we just go ahead and put in a line break, and hold on a moment. I know you can't see that. Just a second. If we go ahead and put in a line break, and I'm going to do this in really large font so it shows up. and we close it. That's the beginning of this clearing, one way of clearing things. But right now, it's just a line break. So it has nothing special about it happening. We would actually have to create a class, and that class would have to have that command put in it to the browser, hey, stop the floating. So usually what it looks like for me is, and I know we haven't covered classes a whole lot, so you're going to roll with this one, and we would apply, and I'll show you the specific technique later in the semester, we'll cover classes. We will apply a class to this line break. I usually call it clear float. And then when I do that, so that's just the behind the scenes code that would be happening. When I do that, then all of a sudden, because I have that in the code before I close my wrapper div. And now my wrapper div says, oh, okay, so we got these 3 boxes floating. I see them now because there's an element in here that has this clear, it's telling the browser to stop floating. And why it works this way, I've yet to get a really great, clear explanation. But it's when you have something so I have this containing div, we'll say it's div ID of wrapper. And if there's something in the div ID of wrapper, some element like this BR, that that is commanding the browser to stop floating, it forces the browser to not only see the element that's saying stop floating, but to see those floated elements. And I know that it does not necessarily make a lot of sense, but again, I have not had a great explanation beyond that. But this is how we suddenly get this containing div to see these boxes.